Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's had a good week so far. And if not, I hope I can make it a little bit better tonight. We are going to be doing more American folklore tonight. I found out that I actually have 2 copies of this book, so I don't really know how or if I could sell the other copy I have, but I do have copies linked on the YouTube channel, anyway. That will go to the Rare Wolf Rare Magical Books listing for it, which again, I do get a minor percentage of the sales. A very minor percentage of sales. But I do try to make sure I have links to be able to buy any of the books that I read on the stream, should anyone want to. So, yeah. I can't think of anything else to really review right now. It does look like my sound is fine. I have been doing some editing on levels when I do the story sections. And of course, my recording resolution is higher than the streaming resolution. Streaming, it usually goes to 720, whereas on my recording, it's still the full 1080. So, Treasury of American Folklore. We should be doing some more Paul Bunyan, and then we will go further from there. Of course, Paul Bunyan is definitely one that people, at least in the United States, might recognize a little bit more than some of the other ones we've done. So, let's go ahead and get over to the study. Again, this is the book I've got. I guess I could take a picture of the other one I have, but I'll give myself the extra work, right? Let's see, starting Paul Bunyan tonight. And we're at the 4th section of it. So, if everyone is ready, we will get into reading. Four, the Bedcats. Old Paul had quite a time with the Bedcats one winter, when he was using one of his old camps that had stood deserted for 30 years more. It happened this way. As everyone knows, the bunkhouses have a certain number of bedbugs. These don't annoy a real lumberjack to amount of anything, although you'll hear the greenhorns holler plenty when they first come into camp. But they either make friends with the little beasts, or they don't last long. The story is that the loggers all had their bedbugs and followed them around camp and out in the woods like dogs, some even being trained, it is said, to steal blankets off adjoining bunks for their masters on especially cold nights. However, that is as it may be, I never saw it. But it is a well-known fact that the intelligent little beasts always knew when camp was to be moved, and the night before would come out wherever they were in the habit of staying and climb into their bedding rolls, as they not to be left behind. When the new camp was set up, There they were, jumping up and down with excitement to greet the men when they came in from their first day's work. One time, though, they got fooled. That was the time the Indian squatting calf comes running into camp just after breakfast with news that gold has been discovered in the Black Hills. Right away, all the men tear out over the hills without even waiting to pick up their blankets. Within 3 minutes, the camp was as empty as an old maid's litter box on Valentine's Day. That night at sundown, the little bugs are all lined up at the bunkhouse door, waiting for the men to come home as usual. But they don't come. Old Paul was in town at the time, and when he hears the news, he goes, there's no use figuring and logging till cold fever passes, as it goes on a timber cruising trip. He locates some fine timber in Kansas way, and when he finds his men ready to work, he starts a new camp there, as he has already market for his lumber in the new gold towns. And, what with one thing or another, it's about 30 years before he comes back to the old camp. But when he does, he finds trouble waiting for him. He and the men get there about noon and start cleaning out all the old buildings, and they're a little surprised to find the bunks filled up with bones of rabbits and other little animals. I suppose that owls or bobcats have been living there. By night, the camp is ready, and after supper, all the men turn in early. Old Paul suddenly wakes up, hearing wild yells and snarls from the bunkhouse, and comes running out of his office to see the men clawing over one another in their underwear, trying to get out in the open. They swear that their bunks was full of wildcats, which have been crawling all over 'em. Now, Paul knows wildcats, and he's never heard of one that'll come within 100 yards of a logger if it has its druthers. And he can find nothing in there when he looks, but figures that, being it's day after payday, the men have probably eaten something that disagrees with them. But they won't go back into the bunkhouse, so he lets them sleep in the stables that night. But the next night, the same thing happens, so Paul decides to get his pistol and sleep in the bunkhouse himself. When a bunch of lumberjacks are scared to sleep in a place, there must be something wrong somewhere. For a time, things are quiet enough to suit anybody, and Paul finally gets a reason that I ever heard of. And Paul finally decides that the men have been reading too many old mystery magazines and dozes off. He wakes up mighty soon. But what feels like a couple of full-grown wildcats seem to have gotten tangled up in his beard, and his blanket is heaving around like he has a runaway cat show under it. The whole bunk is full of animals of some kind, hissing and snarling like all get out. It's none too comfortable there, but old Paul doesn't lose his head. He grabs out in the dark and gets a couple of the beasts and stuffs them into a sack he's got handy. Of course, as soon as he starts floundering, well, the things clear out, like any wild animal, and by the time the men come in running with lanterns, the place is quiet again. They carefully open up the sack to see what they've caught. The animals inside were not bobcats. In fact, nobody's ever seen anything like them. They're about the size of bobcats, but they've got several pairs of legs. They are covered with a heavy coat of reddish-brown fur, which is quite long on the back, and due to the shortness of their legs, it is worn down to the length of plush at the bottom. Naturally, Paul and the men are more than a little puzzled. It is not until the Indians come into camp and they find out what it is they have caught. The Indians call them Bedcats, and from them, Paul learns the story. It seems that the little bugs, being left alone in camp, had to forage for themselves. At first, many died, and the stronger ones survived and grew larger, soon attacking small mice and sparrows. As the years passed, they grew fur to keep them warm, and became more and more savage, each generation a little larger and a little wilder than the one before. Eventually, they were bringing in gophers and small rabbits to feed their young. Later, it seems, they crossed with bobcats, and the half-breeds were really fierce hunters. They took to running in packs like wolves, baying at the moon and pitching to fight a full-grown bobcat was no match for even an ordinary bobcat. The Indians set deadfalls for them and made fur of the ropes and mittens from the pelts. But with the return of the lumberjacks, some forgotten instincts seemed to urge them into the blankets of the bunks, which upset the soundest sleepers. Something had to be done. Old Paul buys the Indians a lot of lumber Old Paul buys the Indians a lot of number for wolf traps and offers a $5 bounty for the scalps, so they are soon trapped out. I haven't heard of any quite that big ever since. Oversized bedbugs. Okay. 5. Johnny Inkslinger. Soon after old Paul invented mass production in the logging business and got the system to working right, he found himself in a peck of trouble. It seems that the logging went so fast he couldn't begin to keep up with his office work. At that time there were no figures as we know them now, so he has to do all the figuring in his head and keep all the records there too. It takes 8 days and 47 hours to figure his payroll alone, and that's only the beginning. There are commissionary accounts and logging records and hay and grain bills and thousands and one other things. His fingers get blistered from counting them, but he doesn't stop, and new blisters form and push the old ones back towards his wrists, and still he keeps on counting. Finally, the tips of his fingers are blistered clear to his elbows. Luckily, they have time to get well by the time they reach the elbows and go no further. But, strain as he may, he can never get more than half done. In desperation, he takes some time off and goes up to the North Pole, where he had left a day stretcher he'd invented when he was logging out in the Arctic. Afterwards, he sold it to the Eskimos, they being pleased with their long nights it gave him. Arriving there, he gives old Chief Fancy Pants a broken jackknife and a lead quarter to stretch a sackful of days he's brought with him. He only has them stretched to twice the usual length, being as he's in quite a sweat to get back to camp and doesn't want to wait. It turns out this is just as well, as he finds that when he tries to use them, he's worse off than before. Naturally, if he was getting behind with the figures when he was working an ordinary day, it stands to reason that working twice as long a day, he'd get twice as far behind. And that's exactly what happened, so after a few days, he has to give the idea up. Hey, Guilty, welcome in. However, he doesn't throw those extra long days out, but being the thrifty, he ships them off to a second-hand dealer in the East who has been peddling them out ever since. Perhaps you yourself can remember days that seemed endless, especially of a Monday. If so, you may be sure that it was one of those days. Almost every school and business has a supply of them. But to get back to Paul's problem, he's in a stew, sure enough. It looks as though he'll have to invent mass production for figuring the same thing he's been logging. But seeing as how it takes a certain amount of time for even Paul to invent inventions, and him being so busy, he thinks he'll first look around camp and see if he can find someone who can help him. Here he runs into trouble. He finds a top loader who can figure a little, but Shoot Gunderson, the wood boss, insists that he can't be spared from the woods, seeing as how he hasn't too many top loaders as it is. Then there's a fellow in the cook shack helping Hot Biscuit Slim. He's been heard to say that he can both spell and cipher. But Sam lets it be known, in no uncertain terms, that dreadful things will probably find their way into the food if his helpers are interfered with. And not even Paul dares to rile up a camp cook. Here he runs. So it looks like the only thing left is to try and teach Backward Bill Barber, the bull cook, to figure. You see, a fellow that's no good for anything else is given the job of carrying wood and water for the cooks, and looking after the bunkhouses. He's called the bull cook, for no good reason that I ever heard of. Naturally, he can very easily be replaced, and Backward Bill gets a job. It's surprising how often people like Backward Bill get put in important jobs because they are so easily replaced where they are. For a while, he seems to do all right, but soon Paul discovers that his figures never come out in anything but odd numbers, and finds that Bill has had a finger cut for some time, which throws his counting into 9s instead of 10s. In an odd number, 9 is much harder to figure with than 10, so that finishes Backward Bill as a figure. Next, old Paul tries a crude system of bookkeeping by means of notches chopped in trees. On one tree he chops payroll notches, on another commissioner bills, and so on. For a time, he keeps a crew of men busy chopping notches as he calls out the numbers. He gets so he can call out three numbers at once, and that's something not everyone can do. This system works fairly well for a time, although Paul hates figures and make mistakes. A notch chopper chopping payroll notches will climb a timber record tree by mistake, or a commissarial chop notcher will get into a hay and grade tree, and soon the records are as badly messaged as before. So again, he's back where he started from. He's losing sleep and weight from worrying, and even then he isn't really getting it all done, as he's so busy with other things. And he has so many notch chopping crews out that he's kinda lost track of them, and isn't all sure he's called them all in. He's haunted by the fear that maybe he's left a crew out in the woods somewhere to starve. For a while, he thinks seriously about going back to the great cave where he grew up and spending his life whittling. I think this was the only time that any problem threatened to be more than old Paul could solve. He kept getting thinner and thinner, and he didn't even have the heart to comb his great beard anymore. It is said that the mess hall was thrown into an uproar one morning at breakfast when two full-grown bobcats chased a snowshoe rabbit out of his whiskers, but that may or may not be true. He gets in the habit of roaming the woods at night, with the faithful ox at his heels, just worrying. One morning, finding himself in a part of the country that estranged him, he decides to explore a little before going back to camp. Although he doesn't know it, he's near Boston, which everyone knows is the seat of learning, culture, and baked beans. However, it is unlikely that he even cared if he had known, as he's already learned practically everything there is to know. He's not interested in culture, and beans are no novelty to a lover. About 10:30, he's sitting on a low hill resting, when he's startled by a yell that uproots all the trees around him. Up to that time, he's supposed that he's the only man that can holler loud enough to knock down trees, so he's more than somewhat curious. He stands up and steps over a couple of small mountains and gets the surprise of his life. Sitting on a hill is a fellow almost as large as Paul himself. He has a high, smooth forehead, and instead of wearing a fur cap, he's bareheaded, which even then was a sign of high learning. But the thing that takes Paul's eye is the color. It is very high, stiff, and pure white, and looks very uncomfortable. It is said that after he went to work for Paul as crew of 39 men busy keeping the Sunday whitewashing. The strange giant is the key is scraping the limestone rough on the other side of the river with a jackknife the size of a four-horse doubletree, scattering the pieces for miles around. When the rock is smooth enough to suit him, he takes an enormous pencil from behind his ear and starts writing down columns of queer marks on it. The pencil is over 3 feet in diameter and 76 feet long, the first one ever used. Paul stands around, first on one foot and then on the other, waiting for him to look up so he can find out who he is and what he's doing. But it seems that the fellow has just invented concentration and is busy practicing it in the works. So, of course, he never bats an eye when Paul shuffles his feet, knocking down 35 acres of standing timber. Nor does he seem to hear when Paul says, "Reckon that's how it's going to be a mighty dry summer if it don't rain soon." As I said before, he was concentrating. Concentrating is mighty exacting operation when it's done right. After a while, however, he finishes what he's doing and turns around to look at Paul. But he still says nothing, and Paul says the same thing, as a white collar has impressed him more than somewhat. So Paul gets out his can of Copenhagen and offers a senator a chaw. Then they both sit and squirt tobacco juice at ants for a little bit, and then they raise the river almost to a flood stage. After they discuss the chance of the rain, Paul asks him what he's doing with the marks on the cliff. He thinks maybe they're just some kind of pictures. The fellow tells him that he's Johnny Inkslinger. Those are figures. But naturally, Paul knows that figures are something that you think but can't see. "Them is figures. I'm sole owner and inventor of 'em," Johnny insists. He shows Paul a little of how they work, even working out a couple of problems that Paul thinks up, and finally convinces him that they really do work. Then Paul wants to know what he figures, and is completely flabbergasted when Johnny tells him that he just figures things for fun, as he has everything that needs figuring all figured. Paul can't imagine a full-grown man sitting around all day figuring just for the fun of it, but Johnny tells him that he's always liked it. As he grew older, he got dissatisfied with just figuring in his head as everyone else did. So he sat down one day and instead of just sitting, he sat and thought that he could do to make the figures more fun. Finally, he hit the idea of inventing figures that could be seen as well as thought. He worked for many months, and the result was a system whereby he could only figure anything, but see the figures at the same time. Moreover, figures figured this way could be written down in books and saved for future reference. This is a system we now use in all our schools. As you can well imagine, old Paul is pretty excited by this time. Here is a mass production of figures, same as he has in London, and the fellow seems to be a real artist, so probably could be hired for practically nothing. If he can get Johnny to work for him, his worries will be over, and he can get out of the woods again. He puts an expression of a man. So he puts on the expression of a man wears when he holds a royal flush and wants to give the other fellow the impression he's bluffing on a pair of deuces, and asks Johnny how he'd like a job figuring for him. Well, Johnny reckons that would be mighty fine, but he's a poor man and can't afford such luxuries. Finally, Paul convinces him that he means that when he says he'll furnish him with all the figuring he can do, besides giving him books to write in and pay him $30 a month. Right away, he starts off for camp at a run. He's that anxious to begin work. He was the first bookkeeper in history, and his job at Old Paul lasted for many years, to great advantage of them both. Okay, well now we know who to blame for accounting. Johnny Inkslinger. 7. Pipeline Days and Paul Bunyan. It was evening, and the sun hung like a sandy ball over the rim of a dull mesquite that surrounded a pipeline camp. For 3 weeks that line had been extended through a lifeless county of mesquite and dust. For 3 weeks the men had been rolling under the August sun, with not even a wind to make the heat less deadening. Now they were sprawled on the grass in an easy after-supper positions, forming a half-circle about the cook shack, and they rested uncomfortably and razzed the lone fat man who had not yet finished eating. Fat was always last start work, less concerned with his tired humor. Gradually the men drifted into small groups and lay droning a preparation of the evening's talk. Get a scoop. That's what you need, Fat. Move the chuck wagon, and he'll starve to death. He's too damn lazy to follow it. Hey, Fat, did you ever get all you wanted to eat? They ought to grow square beans so he could get more of them on his knife. Talk about eating. Tell you what I saw once, said one man aspired to Fat's position as the camp's chief liar. I saw a man eat a whole ham once. Well, not exactly a whole ham. We had eaten a meal off it. Not exactly we, but my brother-in-law Jim and his family. The man came to the house one morning wanting something to eat. Sis was busy and didn't have time to do any fooling with him. So she just set the table and put this ham on it, and then went to do her housework or whatever she was doing. When she came back, the man was gone, and so was the ham, all except the bone, and it had been gnawed so dry that even the dog wouldn't touch it. That's God's truth. Jim swears it's truth. Men howled derisively, and Fat, who had been listening half attentively, rose from his stool and sauntered into the center of the group. Did you say something about eating? He said. Well, I had a funny thing happen to me the other day in Wichita Falls. I goes into one of them restaurants down by the railroad tracks to eat. When I come, I saw a couple of tough hombres sitting at the counter, and they looks at me all amused like. But I just goes to the back and sets down a couple of seats from them. After a while, the waiter comes out from behind and goes over to where they're sitting and asks them what they want. They were some tough-looking birds, and one of them speaks up and says, "Give me a T-bone steak, an inch and a quarter thick, just scorch it." And he looks over at me kind of mean-like. But I didn't pay him no mind, just sat there. The other one pulls his hat and way down over his eyes and says, "Give me a hind quarter, raw." And they both looks over at me. Well, when the waiter came over to where I'm sitting, I says to him, Give me a sharp butcher knife and then a couple of steer and run him through here. I'll cut off what I want. Speaking of steers, the contender put in, did you ever hear about the cattle line that Paul Bunyan laid on his ranch in Chicago? Well, Paul, he got tired of paying such a high freight to get his stock to market, so he just laid a pipeline all the way to the stockyards in Chicago and pumped them through it. Everything went all right, except that the pipe was so big the cows and half-grown yearlings would get lost in the threads and starve to death before they could get to the outside. And one time the line sprung a leak, and Paul lost 35 carloads of cattle before he could get it corked, or caulked. But he sure did do a good job of corking it when he did. How the devil do you cork a hole that big? Asked Fat in a minute or two of silence. Why, with BS, you big windbag, same as you do with that coat I've been spouting off. Fat sat for a moment trying to think of a way to get back at the contender. Then he started off a new trail. Well, you know so much about Paul Bunyan, he said. Did you ever hear about that big steer that he had? He called her Babe, and she just measured 42 pick handles in height and width of 7 derby hats between the eyes, and strong. Why, that steer could pull anything. I remember one time when he was drilling down in Breckenridge way. He wasn't much of a hole, just 16 inches. Well, we drilled and didn't ever strike nothing except dust. And God's a plenty of that. So finally Paul said he might have to give up on a dry hole and let it go at that. But Paul was mad. He swore around 2 or 3 days and smashed the derrick into kindling wood, and was about to quit drilling when he saw an advertisement in the paper by some bird out in the plains that wanted to buy some post holes. 10,000 post holes it was that he wanted, and 10,000 holes, 3 feet long. Well, Paul, he hitched the train around the duster hole and hooked up Babe, pulled 15,000 of it out of the ground. He got mad again because the hole broke off and left over half in the ground, but directly he said that there wasn't no use in the post hole being 16 inches across, so he just quartered the hole and then sawed it up on the right ends. You know, out in the plains they have an awful hard time digging post holes, or any kind of holes for that matter. The soil out there is only about a foot deep till you strike solid rock. They can't dig their way through rock at all. Well, them guys used to come down to East Texas and buy all the oil wells and dugouts that they could get a hold of and cut them up front for post holes. Well, I used to know a feller down there that could dig a stack of cars on more wells than any man I ever saw before. He could stack 29 of them on cars in a day and take 2 hours off for dinner. Well, they finally moved so many wells from down there that they ruined the waters, so there was an ordinance passed against it. But they didn't stop it. They bootlegged them out on the plains. I knew a guy that was rich bootlegging on them. They had a patented jack that could lift a well or dugout right out of the ground. It don't do much to build fences out on the plains, though. That where the wind out there is awful. As soon as a man gets a good fence built, along comes the wind and blows it away, posts, post holes and all. Why, the wind even blows wells away, and the guy told me that he had seen it turn a prairie dog holes wrong side out, it blew so hard. Yeah, I can see that. But I never did believe it. Them guys are awful liars. One of them told me that he had a horse throw him up so high that he had to catch a hold of a cloud and keep from falling and killing himself. It's cold out there, too. I'll say it is, the pipeliner broke in. Guy like that was up in Canada sometimes when I was 50 degrees below. He come up to another guy and said, God, man, wouldn't you hate to be in Amarillo today? I kind of hate it every day. Did you ever hear about them wells out in Colorado where the oil freezes up when it comes out of the ground? That's the contender. They can't pipe it away, so they just let it spout over the ground and shovel it into wagons with scoops and haul it off. That's like some of them wells that Paul Bunyan drilled over there in Smackover, said someone. They was gushers and blew winds so strong that they put roofs over the derricks to keep the oil from spouting a hole in the sky. I worked for Paul out in Arizona on the biggest well I ever worked on, returned the contender. It was a 75-inch hole, and it was when we had the derrick so tall that it was hinged by 2 places and folded up before the sun and moon could pass. It took a man 14 days to climb to the top of it, did, and Paul had to hire 30 derrick men so we could have a man on top at all times. But there was always the 14 men going up and 14 coming down. A man on top and a man off tower all the time. And there was doghouses built in days climb apart for the men to sleep in when they're going up and down. Well, when that well blew in, it took 3 days for the oil to reach the top of the derrick, and it rained oil for a week after it got cropped. Well, it was some well. He drilled it with one of Paul's patented rotary rigs. Never could have drilled so deep. It was 60,000 feet. If Paul hadn't made that flexible drill pipe, we just wound the drill stem up from the drawworks. It takes a devil a long time to come out of a hole if we had to stack it. Well, when we was down 60,003 feet, the well blew it, and we had to come out of the hole. We had seen that we forgot to case it. Well, Paul calls out both towers and made up the casing on the ground, about 10 miles and 75 feet, 75-inch casing, and then he just picked it up and chopped it down to a place. It worked for Paul when he was in one of the deep wells once, said Fat. It was out in Arkansas. Jimmy Blue was running the rig and we was drilling with standard tools. We got down 30,000 feet and struck a rock formation that we couldn't budge. And it was using a pretty good standard bit, too, drilling a 50-inch hole. Well, we worked in the formation for 3 weeks without doing any good, and then we called up Paul. Paul, he come out there and took charge of the rig himself and worked for 3 more weeks, day and night, without doing anything except ruin a lot of bits. He finally got so mad he just jumped up on the derrick and pulled at the bit with his... He pulled up the bit with his hands. Then he threw it down the hole as hard as he could throw it. Well, we busted the rock that time. It just kept going, and when it ran out of line, he pulled the derrick rig and all the hole after it. We got a gusher that time, but when Paul seen that rig had pulled Jimmy into the hole with it, he just about pulled off the hole and abandoned it. But in a few days, we got a telegram from Jimmy in China saying that he had 100,000 barrel gusher and was spudding in another location. Did any of you guys work for Paul on that big line he laid? Asked the contender. Well, I worked for him on that 101-inch aluminum line that he laid from Pennsylvania to California. We laid it to pipe buttermilk out of his camp there. Paul liked buttermilk so well himself, he had a 24-inch petcock running wide open all the time to catch enough for him to drink. Yeah, said Fat. I know about that. I helped Paul drill the buttermilk that was finishing that line. We drilled down 32,000 feet and struck a formation of cornbread. We drilled for 500 feet through the cornbread, then 1,200 feet through solid turnip greens, except that every few feet there would be a layer of fried sow belly. There was good song. That's where the old song started. Cornbread, buttermilk, and good old turnip greens. Fat, do you ever see Paul's wife? Asked a young bull weevil who had started to work only a few days before. She had a wooden leg, and she was so homely that we used to scrape enough ugly off her face every day to mud the well. The hardest 6 months' work I ever put on was painting that wooden leg of hers. When Paul worked in the high lines, he had a wooden leg himself, added the next lineman. It was 90 feet long, and men used to wear out one every 3 days climbing up to bum him for cigarettes. Paul discovered perpetual motion of the jaw when he got Fat to work for him, said the contender. Huh? Said Fat. The only perpetual motion Paul ever discovered was the one time down in India. We was drilling a 90-inch hole with standard tools, and we got down 27,000 feet, and we struck a root of a rubber tree, and the bit never did stop bouncing. Had to abandon the hole. Oh, it worked, said the contender. Yeah, and another one of them wells we was drilling was 80-inch offsets. Had big derricks all around us. Our camp was set so far back from the derricks we had to pipe the daylight in. We drilled down nearly 50,000 feet and struck a flowing vein of aluminum water, and the whole rig and everything drew up until we had to abandon it. "Oh, sure had drilling down to a fine point," said the contender. "Why, I worked for him on one hole where we was using rubber tools. We never could get the start of the tools bouncing, and we'd go to sleep until it was time to change the bit. And the men was so fast a driller, he could just bounce the bit out in the hole, and they would change it as fast as it could fall back." "Paul's camps was nothing like this dump," said Fat. "I worked for him at a 90-inch line once, and we had so many men in the camp that it took 15 adding machines running day and night to keep track of their time. Paul invented the first ditching machine while he was fleeing back behind through Arkansas. He brought a drove of them razorback hogs and trained them to root in a straight line." "You're telling about that cattle line of Paul's a while back reminds me of one of the trees that used to grow down in the brazos," said the old man. "One time I was working through that country with a herd of cattle and come up to the river where I couldn't ford it. While I was setting up my horse to look at the water, I heard a big catfish in the river. When I went up to see what it was a tree falling across the river. It was one of them big holler trees, so I drove the herd across the river through the holler of it. But when I got to the other side and counted the herd, I seen that there were nearly 300 steers missing, and I went back to look for them. Thought they had wandered into the limbs and got lost." "That reminds me of the sandstorms we used to have down in East Texas," said the contender. "Each time one time there was a nigger riding along one of them sandy roads on a jackass and stopped to go down to the creek and get a drink and tied his mule to a sapling on the side of the road. While he was gone, it come one of them sandstorms, and when he come back to see his ass laying, he come back, he seen his ass hanging by the rope tie almost 70 feet up in the tree. The sand had blown away from under him and just left him hanging there." "Say," said Fat, "did any of you guys ever see Paul Bunyan at a poker game? The cards he used were so big that it took a man 5 hours to walk around one of them. Paul used to play a lot of poker that time we were in Rocky Mountains. No. Paul used to play a lot of poker that time we was digging Lake Michigan to mix concrete in when he was building the Rocky Mountains. A little while after that, we dug Lake Superior for a slush pit for one of them big wells he was running. Any of you birds want to play some poker?" This, from Fat, was a signal for retiring. The sun was long past set, and the mosquitoes were buzzing in the darkened mesquites. Suddenly, the men stalked off towards their toilets, except the 2 or 3 that followed Fat to his tent for a session of poker. That one was just everywhere. But that was also the last part of Paul Bunyan for this section. Yeah, Paul Bunyan came back in some. It looks like we're doing on Paul Bunyan. Yep. Which means we get to start on a new person. Which has definitely had European influence on it because of the name. Febold Feboldson. 1. Real American weather. Somebody ought to do something about the weather. It's downright disgraceful that in most parts of the United States, the climate is of foreign origin. Florida and California brazenly boast of Mediterranean sunshine. Winter resorts in the Adirondacks have only limitations than those of Switzerland. Even the most famous blizzard of 1888 came from Siberia. In fact, there's only one place where you can get real, genuine American weather, and that's one of the Great Plains between the Mississippi and the Rockies. In the early days, I guess, it was even more American than it is now. At least that's what Bertram Stromberg says. He's way past 90 and has some big weather in his day. Besides, he's heard about the climate from the early days from his uncle, the famous Febold Feboldson. Febold was the first white settler west of the Mississippi, counting Spaniards and Frenchmen, who don't count anyway. In 1848, for instance, that was the year that petrified snow covered the plains all summer and held up the 48ers in their gold rush to California, with the results that they became 49ers. At that time, Febold was operating an ox train between San Francisco and Kansas City because the snow prevented him from doing anything else. Since Febold was the only plainsman able to make the trip that year, the 48ers appealed to him for help. His secret was to load up with sand from Death Valley, California. The sands of the desert never grow cold, nor did Febold and his oxen. This sand he sold to the gold rushers at $50 a bushel, and they were glad for it. Then the 49ers began to swarm over the snow-covered plains with their prairie schooners. But before they reached the Rockies, the jolting of the wagons scattered the sand and covered up every bit of the petrified snow. And that's the reason, according to Bergstrom Stromberg, that the prairies are so fired hot in the summer. Febold cursed himself 20 times a day for 20 years for selling the 48ers that sand. Then he spent the next 20 years trying various schemes to moderate the climate. He finally gave up in disgust and moved to California. Thus, he set an example which all good Midwesterners have followed ever since. Or take the popcorn ball. There is a genuine American product. Most people think that someone invented the popcorn ball, but it's actually just a product of the American weather. It invented itself, so to speak, though Bergstrom Stromberg's ranch in the early days when Febold owned the place. It was weather that particular year known as the Year of the Striped Heat. The year that the weather was both hot and rainy. It was during that particular year, known as the Year of the Striped Weather, which came between the years of the Big Rain and the Great Heat. This year, the weather was both hot and rainy. There was a mild strip of scorching sunshine and then a strip of rain. And so it happened that Febold's farm was in both kinds of weather. The sun shone on his cornfield until the corn began to pop, while the rain washed the syrup out of his sugar cane. Now, the cane field was on a hill, and the cornfield in the valley. The syrup flowed downhill into that popped corn and rolled into great balls. Bergstrom says that some of them hundreds of feet high and looked like big tennis balls in the distance. He had never seen any of them because the grasshoppers ate them all up in one day. June 21st, 1874. We are doing Febold Feboldson at the moment. Complaining about American weather. And I've got some getting seconds. But the Great Fog, I suppose, was the biggest piece of American weather that ever hit the Great Plains. It followed the year of the Great Heat, which killed off the Dirty Leg Indians and Paul Bunyan's Blue Lots. Near the end of that remarkable year, according to Bergstrom Stromberg, it began to rain and keep it up for the proverbial 40 days and nights. But nary a drop of water hit the ground, said Bergstrom. What became of it, I asked. Why, it all turned to steam, of course. That there rain had no more chance of hitting the ground than you have spitting into a blast furnace. The steam, as Bergstrom says it, cooled enough to turn into fog. The whole country was fog-bound. It was so thick that people had to go around in pairs, one to hold the fog apart while the other walked through. Pioneer ranchers didn't need water to stock. The cattle would just simply drink the fog. It looked funny seeing pigs with their noses up in the air rooting for fish and frogs. But dirt farmers were so mad that the stockmen were happy. The sun couldn't shine through the fog, and the seeds didn't know which way was up, so they grew downward. Things were getting pretty serious. All the farmers had just about decided to go to California when Febold came to their rescue. He hit upon the idea of importing some English fog cutters from London, but the English were so slow that Febold couldn't get his fog cutters until Thanksgiving, and then the fog had turned to slush. He finally got to work and cut up the fog and slush into long strips, which he laid out on the roads as to not spoil the fields. Of course, the time the dust covered up the roads until you can finally till you can hardly tell where Febold buried the great fog. Many a rural Americaner has cursed Febold and his English fog cutters, for every spring when it rains or thaws, that old fog comes up seeping up and makes rivers of mud in the country roads. 2. Why Febold went to California. Just why and when Febold went to California, and whether he went for good or only to visit, no one perhaps will ever know. Bergstrom Stromberg thinks he's only gone for a visit. Eldad Johnson is probably the same opinion, but Bergstrom's presence, he always takes opposite view, and gives vent to his exasperation with his native prairies of his own suppressed desire to go to California. All you need to start them off is just ask a casual manner when Febold is coming back. He ain't ever coming back, Eldad will snap at you in the voice anything is casual. How do you know he ain't? Said Bergstrom, lost. Because any man as smart as Febold would know enough to stay away from this here man-killing, God-forsaken country. If you ain't burned up by the drought and winds as hot as hell, or frozen out by blizzards and hailstorms, you'll eat up by grasshoppers, spectators, and politicians. Febold tried his damnedest to make this country fit for a white man to live in, but it can't be done. I don't blame him for going off to California with the rest of them sensible people. Oh, there, ain't you a little strong? Bergstrom would say. Remember, Febold ain't no lily-livered cake-eater like you. These here plains is tough country, and it takes tough people to live here, and Febold never backs out. Just the same, he did go to California, and he ain't back yet, and never will be. Damned if I wouldn't go myself if I only had time and money. I know Febold was a tough feller and liked a good big job, but he was smart too, smart enough to know when he was licked. Licked, hell, he ain't begun to fight yet. All those tricks he used to pull in the early days ain't nothing to do with what's going to be done when he gets back. Say, do you really want to know why Febold went to California? Want to know? Craps, I do know. And so does everybody else with a lick of sense. He went to get away from here and enjoy his old age without fighting the damned country for a living all the time. I heard he was a bartender in Tijuana until he made a little money on the horses. Then he bought some steamships trading with China or somewhere. I think he had a fruit farm too, and that was in the movies for a while. Rot, you old fool. You ought to know Febold's too big a man for a monkey to do such things. Horse races, steamships, fruit farms, movies, bah. Do you think Febold would mess around with all that stuff? Never. He went to California with such study. Study what? He did, always in the tone of utmost contempt. Irrigation and forestry, Bergstrom always replies. Science, you know, things is done different now. When Febold gets back, he's gonna put some water on trees on these here plains, and no fooling. Can't be done, said Eldad. You just wait and see, said Bergstrom. Thus, Bergstrom and Eldad are wont to dispute a second coming of their famous uncle far into the proverbial night. But just why and when Febold went to California, and whether he went for good or only for a visit, no one perhaps will ever know. And ads are coming up. When we get back, we're going to have another big hero. And very likely a lot of more coarse language. Because we'll be getting John Henry. So it'll be interesting. Let's go ahead and take a break. I'll see you back in a while. I don't know why my cats have decided they just don't want to be on camera anymore. Anyway, welcome back. Like I said before the break, we'll be getting to John Henry. And I'm giving the warning now because, well, language. Not that there wasn't language in Paul Bunyan, but I say it so casually, I guess no one ever notices. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, honestly. Blow my nose and didn't want to blow up the speakers. Anyway. Continuing on with our next Miracle Man. I believe that's the section right. John Henry. 1. John Henry, the hero. All questions of authenticity of the John Henry tradition fade into insignificance before the incontrovertible fact for his countless admirers, John Henry is a reality. To them, he will always be a hero, an idol, a symbol of the natural man. It is often charged against the Negro that he glorifies his tough characters as bad men. But when one considers that the Negro has had little opportunity to develop outside the fields of labor and hell-raising, this tendency is not surprising. Bad men are nearly always interesting, and incidentally, no one can sing of them any more heartily than a white man. But a miracle man fits into the drab scene of everyday life, and it is a miracle if he achieves any sort of notoriety for his hard work. John Henry, then, is a hero indeed. With his hammer and his determination to prove his superiority over machine, he has made a name for himself in folk history. His super strength, his grit, his endurance, and his martyrdom appeal to something fundamental in the heart of common man. John Henry stands for something which is the pick and shovel Negro idolizes: brutal strength. He epitomizes the tragedy of man versus machine, laying down his life for the sake of convincing himself and others that he could beat the machine. He did something that many a Negro would gladly do. The whole thing is a sort of alluring tragedy which appeals strongly to one's egotism. So strong, indeed, has been the admiration, the envy of every other man for John Henry, that some have tried to repeat his drama. I have no doubt that some of these John Henry episodes said to have happened in so many places throughout the country, the Alabama episode, for instance, are based on real incidents in which a would-be John Henry did their best to put themselves beside the god of the hammer. Mention John Henry to a group of Negro working men, and the chances are that you start an admiration contest. A rare man who intimates that he could beat John Henry is left down by his fellows. "Why, man," said the true John Henryites on such an occasion, "John Henry could take a hammer beneath his teeth and drive with his hands tied behind." This is the language in the book, so. "Why, man," said a true John Henryite on such an occasion, "John Henry could take that hammer between his teeth and drive with his hands tied behind and beat you all to get out." "Yes, Lord," confirmed another, "that man that had a stroke like an Alabama mule." "They tells me," said a third, "that he used to keep 6 men running just to carry his drillbacks and forth from the man that was sharpening them." and so on until no one could think of anything else to say about him. F.P. Barker, an old Alabama steel driver who claimed to have known John Henry, said, I could drive from both my shoulders myself, and I was as far behind John Henry as the moon is behind the sun. The world has not yet produced a man to whip steel like John Henry. A young woman in Georgia concluded an account of John Henry's life as follows. When he died, people came out from all parts of the world to see his famous man, John Henry. His wife had it engraved on his tombstone. His epitaph, sick, Here lies a steel-driving man. John Henry was a way of cropping up at unexpected times and places. He was standing on the street at Chapel Hill one night, and a throng of people gathered to hear the Dempsey-Sharkey fight on the radio. When things looked bad for Dempsey, a Negro man who stood near began to show his displeasure. They'd put old Jack Jackson in there, he'd say. He'd lay that Sharkey man out. At the end of the round we discussed, colored prize fighters, suddenly he came out with, I'll bet you another colored man that have made a real prize fighter. That's John Henry. Yes, sir, any man that could handle a 30-pound hammer like that would make a sure enough fighter. There is, on the whole, a surprisingly small amount of exaggeration in the stories about John Henry told by those who worship at his shrine. Occasionally, you hear that John Henry used a 30-pound hammer, or that he wore out 6 shakers a day on a famous contest, or his statue had been carved in solid rock at the portal of Big Bend Tunnel. But around John Henry, there has not yet grown up a body of fantastic lore like that which surrounds other certain folk characters. Paul Bunyan, for example. The only really bizarre tale I've ever heard about John Henry is the one that Professor Howard W. Odrin obtained for the construction cathedral at Chapel Hill 3 years ago. I repeat it here, just as it was published in Negro Workday Songs. One day old John Henry left Rock Quarter on a way to camp and had to go through the woods and fell. Well, he met a big black bear and didn't go nothing but shoot him wild with a bow and arrow, and the arrow went clean through the bear and struck a big tree on the other side. So John Henry pulls the arrow out of the tree and pulls so hard that he falls back against another tree, which was so full of footed jacks, and the first tree was so full of honey, and pulling the arrow out of one of the shaken down honey, and the falling against the other shaken down footed jacks. Well, John Henry sat there and ate honey and footed jacks, and about a while he went to get up and go. The button pops off his pants and kill a little rabbit 100 yards on the other side of the tree. And so up jumped a brown-baked pig, with a sack of biscuits on his back, and John Henry ate him up too. So John Henry gets up and goes through the woods to camp for supper, 'cause he about to be late and mighty hungry for his supper. And John Henry sees a lake downhill and thinks he'll go for a drink of water, 'cause him's thirsty too, after eating honey and footed jacks and brown roast pig and biscuits. He's still hungry. There he goes down to get a drink of water and finds the lake ain't nothing but a lake of honey, and in the middle of that lake there's nothing but a tree full of biscuits. So John Henry don't do nothing but drink that lake of honey dry. And he got the tree full of biscuits too. And about that time it was getting dark, and John Henry sees the light on the hill, and he thinks maybe he can get something to eat, 'cause he's mighty hungry after a big day drilling. He looks around and sees the lights on the hill, and runs up to the house where the light is. And there's people living there. Why the hell don't they give him something to eat? 'Cause he ain't had much, and he's the that too. Gee hee, that nigger could eat. And that ain't all, Captain. That nigger could walk up so and could eat. He great steel driller ever alive, regular job. He was. He could drill with his hammer and more than 2 steam drills, and some of them say more than 10. Always begging boss to get him bigger hammer. John Henry was cut out for a big gaunt driller. One day he was just a few weeks old, sitting on his mammy's knee and commenced crying. His mama say, John Henry, what's the matter, little son? And he up and say right down there that he wants a 9-pound hammer to beat him. Be death of it. Sure enough, he grow up right, weighing the biggest steel driller the world ever seen. Why, this I telling you just now was when he's a young fellow. Wait till I tells you about he's drilling in the mountains in Pennsylvania. And so one day he'd drill all the way to Rome, Georgia, and Decatur. More than 100 miles drilling in one day. And I sure ain't that was his best day. No, I ain't sure that was his best day. But, boss, John Henry was a regular boy, and not like them old giants write about not liking women and nothing. John Henry loved to come to town, same as any other nigger, only more so. 'Cause he more important than all that, and he 'cause he had no women than anybody else. Some said more than 10, but that is what I don't know. I mean, boss, no women and 10 men. Good Lord. I expects he has more than 1,000 women. And John Henry was a great cutting man, too, Captain. Always was that way. Why, one day he was sitting on his old paw and sat out in front of the old house, just a few weeks old, and women come along and claim him for their man. And that's funny, too, but it's showing that day of his life. And so when we come to die, John Henry had no more women, and dressed in red and blue and all them fine colors come to see him dead. If it last thing they do, and it was a mighty sad sight. People all standing round, both in color and white. That is how it is written in the book. 2. John Henry drove his steel with a 10-pound sheep-nose hammer with a regular-sized switch handle 4 feet long. This handle was made slim from where the hammer fitted to a few inches back where it was reduced to 1/2 inch in thickness, the width being 5/8 in the slim part. It was kept greased with tallow to keep it limber and flexible, so as to not jar the hands and arms. It would stand from 5 to 1 feet tall. He would stand from 5 1/2 feet to 6 feet from the steel, strike with the full length of his hammer. The handle was so limber that when it was held out straight, the hammer would hang nearly halfway down. He drove steel from his left shoulder and would make a stroke of more than 19 1/2 feet, spending his power with all his might, making the hammer travel with the speed of lightning. He would throw his hammer over his shoulder, and nearly the full length of the handle would be down his back, with the hammer just between his legs, just below his knees. He would drive 10 long hours, never turning a stroke. John Henry could stand on 2 powder cans and drive a drill straight up equally as fast as he could drive it straight down, with the same long sweep and rapidity of the hammer. He would stand on a powder with 2 feet together, toes even, drive all day, never missing a stroke. He was the steel driving champion of the country, and his record has never been equaled. John Henry was the best driver on the C&O. He was the only man that could drive steel with 2 hammers, one in each hand. People came from miles to see him use 2 20-pound hammers he had to drive with. It seems that 2 different contracting companies were meeting in what was called the Big Bend Tunnel. One had a steam drill and the other used man-powered drill with. When they met, everyone claimed that the steam drill was the greatest of all inventions, but John Henry made the remark that he could sink more steel than that steam drill could. The contest was arranged and the money put up. John Henry was to get his $100 to beat the steam drill. John Henry had his foreman buy him 2 new 20-pound hammers for the race. They were to drill 35 minutes. When the contest was over, John Henry had drilled 2 holes 7 feet deep, which made him a total of 14 feet. The steam drill drilled 1 hole 9 feet, which of course gave a prize to John. When the race was over, John Henry retired to his home and told his wife that he had a queer feeling in his head. She prepared his supper, and immediately after eating he went to bed. Next morning, when his wife awoke and told him it was time to get up, she received no answer. She immediately discovered that he had passed to the other world some time in the night. His body was examined by 2 doctors from Baltimore, and it was found his death was caused from a burst blood vessel in his head. The information I have given you came to me through my grandfather. He was present at Big Bend Tunnel when the contest was staged. At that time, he was a timekeeper for the crew that John Henry was working with. I've heard him say that his watch started and stopped the race. There was present all of the RR officials of the C&O. The crowd that remained through the race at the mouth of the tunnel was estimated at 2,500, a large crowd for pioneer days. John Henry was born in Tennessee and at the time of his death was 34 years old. He was a man weighing from 200 to 225. He was a full-blooded Negro, his father having come from Africa. He often said his strength was brought from Africa. He was not any relation to John Hardy, as far as I know. Oh, no, there's a song. Ah, several pages of song. I think it's just one song. Yep, just one song. No, there's two songs. Okay. I'm probably not going to get the music done for this. Can't say I've ever actually seen Symphony 2 too. I would definitely not be getting the sound right. Anyway. 2. John Henry. John Henry was a little baby, sitting on his mama's knee, oh yeah. Said, the Big Bend Tunnel on the C&O Road is gonna be the death of me. Lord, Lord, gonna cause the death of me. John Henry had a woman, her name was Mary Magdalene. She would go to the tunnel and sing for John, just to hear John Henry's hammer ring. Lord, Lord, just to hear John Henry's hammer ring. John Henry had a little woman, her name was Lucy-Ann. John Henry took a sick and had to go to bed. Lucy-Ann drove steel like a man. Lord, Lord, Lucy-Ann drove steel like a man. Captain says to John Henry, gonna bring me a steam drill round. Gonna take that steam drill out of the job. Gonna whoop that steel on down. Lord, Lord, gonna whop that steel on down. John Henry told his captain, Latin was in his eye. Captain, bet your last red cent on me, 'cause for I'll beat it to the bottom or I'll die. Lord, Lord, I'll beat it to the bottom or I'll die. Sunshine hot and burning, weren't no breeze at all. Sweat ran down like water down a hill. That day John Henry let his hammer fall. Lord, Lord, that day John Henry let his hammer fall. John Henry went to the tunnel and they put him in the lead drive. The rock so tall and John Henry so small. Daddy laid down his hammer and he cried. Lord, Lord, and Daddy laid down his hammer and he cried. John Henry started on the right hand. The steam drill started on the left. Before I'll let the steam drill beat me down, I'll hammer my fool self to death. Lord, Lord, I'll hammer my fool self to death. White man told John Henry, nigga damn your soul, you beat this steam and drill of mine. When the rocks in this mountain turn to gold, Lord, Lord, when the rocks in this mountain turn to gold. John Henry said to the speaker, nigga, why don't you sing? I'm throwing 12 pounds from my hips and down. Just listen to the call and steel ring, Lord, Lord, just listen to the call, steel ring. Oh, the captain said to John Henry, I believe this mountain is sinking. And John Henry said to the captain, oh my, ain't nothing but my hammer sucking wind. Ain't, Lord, Lord, ain't nothing but my hammer sucking wind. John Henry told the shaker, shaker, you better pray. Or if I miss this 6-foot steel, tomorrow gonna be your burying day. Lord, Lord, tomorrow will be your burying day. John Henry told his captain, look yonder what I see. Your drill's done broke and your hole's done choked. You ain't can't drive steel like me. Lord, Lord, you can't steel drive like me. The man that invented the steel drill thought he was mighty fine. John Henry drove his 15 feet, and the steam drill only made 9. Lord, Lord, and the steam drill only made 9. The hammer that John Henry swung, it weighed over 9 pounds. Broke a rib from his left-hand side, and his entrails fell to the ground. Lord, Lord, his entrails fell to the ground. John Henry was a hammering on the mountain, and his hammer was a striking fire. He drove so hard he broke his poor heart, and he laid down his hammer and he died. Lord, Lord, he laid down his hammer and he died. All the women's in the west, when they heard John Henry's death, stood in the rain, flagged an eastbound train. Going where John Henry fell dead, Lord, Lord, going where John Henry fell dead. John Henry's little mother, she was dressed all in red. She jumped in bed and covered up her head. She didn't know that her son was dead, Lord, Lord, didn't know her son was dead. John Henry had a pretty little woman, and her dress was blue. And the last word she said to him, John Henry, I've been true to you. Lord, Lord, John Henry, I've been true to you. And there's a second one. 2. Well, every Monday morning blues when the bluebirds begin to sing. You can hear those hammers a mile or more. You can hear John Henry's hammer ring. Oh, Lordy, hear John Henry's hammer ring. John Henry told his old lady, will you fix my supper soon? Got 90 miles of track I've got to line it by the light of the moon. Oh, Lordy, line it by the light of the moon. John Henry had a little baby, he could hold him in his hand. But the last word I heard old Paul say, my daddy's a steel-driving man. Oh, Lordy, daddy is a steel-driving man. John Henry told his old Indian captain, I said I ain't nothing but a man. Before I let your seal gang down, I will die with a hammer in my hand. Oh, Lordy, die with a hammer in my hand. John Henry told his captain, next time you go to town, and just bring him back a 10-pound maul. For to be just still driving down, oh, Lordy, to be just still driving down. John Henry had an old lady. Her name was Polly Ann. John Henry's took sick, and he had to go to bed. Polly Ann drove steel like a man. Oh, Lordy, land steel like a man. John Henry had an old lady, and the dress she wore was red. And she started going up the track and never looked back. Going where my man fell down dead. Oh, Lordy, where my man fell dead. Well, they take John Henry to Washington, and they buried him in the sand. There's peoples from the east and peoples from the west come to see such a steel-driving man. Oh, Lordy, to see such a steel-driving man. Well, some said he was from England, and some said he was from Spain. But I'll say he's nothing but a losing man, just a leader of a steel-driving gang. Oh, Lordy, leader of a steel-driving gang. Two songs for the low, low price of me reading a book. Oh, come on. Okay. Let's say there's another song? No. Anyway. 3. The birth of John Henry. Now, John Henry was a man, but he's long dead. The night John Henry was born, the moon was copper-colored, and the sky was black. The stars wouldn't shine, and the rain fell hard. Forked lightning cleaved the air, and the earth trembled like a leaf. The panthers sprawled in a break like a baby, and the Mississippi River ran upstream 1,000 miles. John Henry weighed 45 pounds. John Henry was born on the banks of the Black River, where all the good roustabouts came from. He came from the world of a cotton hook for a right hand and a river song on his tongue. Looked up and down the river, twice as far as I could see. See, before I gets to 21, the anchor line gonna belong to me. Lord, Lord, the anchor line gonna belong to me. I feel like that would be part of the first song. Yep. First one was a while ago. Okay. They didn't know what to make of John Henry when he was born. They looked at him and then went and looked at the river. "You got a bass voice like a preacher," said. "He's got a bass voice like a preacher," his mama said. "He got shoulders round like cotton roll and roustabout," his papa said. He's got blue gums like a conjure man, the nurse woman said. I might preach some, said John Henry, but I ain't going to be no preacher. I might roll cotton on the boats, but I ain't going to be no cotton river roustabout. I might got blue gums like a conjure man, but I ain't going to get familiar with their spirits. So my name is John Henry, and when folks talk about my name, they'll know I was a natural man. His name is John Henry, said his mother. It's a fact. When he calls him by his name, said his papa, he's a natural man. About that time, John Henry raised up and stretched. Well, he said, ain't about supper time? Sure, it's about supper time, said his mamma. And after, said his papa. Long after, said the nursewoman. Well, said John Henry, did the dogs have their supper? They did, said his mamma. All the dogs, said his papa. Long since, said the nursewoman. Well then, said John Henry, ain't I as good as the dogs? And when John Henry said that, he got mad. He reared back on his bed and broke out the slats. He opened his mouth and yowled, and it put out the lamp. He cleaved his tongue and spat, and then put out the fire. Don't make me mad, said John Henry, and the thunder rumbled and rolled. Don't let me get mad on the day I was born, 'cause I'm scared my own self when I gets mad. And John Henry stood up in the middle of the floor, and he told them what he wanted. Bring me 4 ham bones and a pot full of cabbages, he said. Bring me a bait of turnip greens, treetop tall, and season it down with a bit of middling. Bring me a pone of cold cob brand and some pot liquor to wash it down. Bring me 2 hog jowls and a kettleful of whippoorwill peas. Bring me a skilletful of red-hot biscuits and a big jug full of cane molasses. My name is John Henry, and I will see you soon. So John Henry walked out of the house and away from the Black River country, where all good roustabouts are born. So, that's John Henry. Now it's going to be really fun. The next one. I don't really know if it's going to be really fun, because there's another one that people don't really think about that much. Our next miracle man. Casey Jones. 1. Casey Jones, engineer. Part 1. On the last day of April 1928 occurs the 20th anniversary of the death of Casey Jones, probably the most famous of a long line of locomotive engineer heroes who have died at their post of duty, one hand on the whistle and the other hand on the air brake lever. Casey Jones's fame rests for nondescript verses, which can hardly be called poetry. They were written by Wallace Sanders, a Negro engineer wiper who had been a close friend of the famous engineer, and who sang them in a jiggity melody all his own. Mrs. Casey Jones still lives in Jackson, Tennessee. She has 2 sons and a daughter. Charles Jones, the younger son, lives in Jackson. Lloyd, the older son, is in Memphis Auto Agency, and his daughter, Mrs. George McKenzie, lives in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Tuscaloosa. Although 41 years have flitted by since Miss Janie Brady said "I do" and became the bride of John Luther Casey Jones, Mrs. Jones still keeps green in the memory of the glad occasion. Today, still on the sunny side of 60, the plump blonde woman with her cheery smile tells graphically the story of how her husband was killed, and how Wallace Saunders composed the original air and words that later swept the country for years as the epic ballad of the railroader. My husband's real name was John Luther Jones, she told her latest interviewer. He was a lovable lad, 6 feet 4 1/4 inches in height, dark-haired and gray-eyed, Always he was in a good humor, and his Irish heart was as big as his body. All the railroaders were fond of Casey, and all his wiper, Wallace Saunders, just worshipped the ground he walked on. The interviewer asked Mrs. Jones how her husband got the name Casey. Oh, I suppose everyone knew that, she replied. He got it from the town of Case, Kentucky, which he was born. The name of the town was pronounced in two syllables, exactly like Casey. Mrs. Jones remembers Wallace Saunders very well, although she has not seen him for years. Wallace's admiration for Casey was a little short of idolatry, she said. He used to brag mightily about Mr. Jones, even when Casey was only a freight engineer. Casey Jones was known far and wide among railroadmen for his particular skill with the locomotive whistle. You see, said Mrs. Jones, he established a sort of trademark for himself in his imitable method of blowing a whistle. It was kind of a long drawn-out note that he created, beginning softly and rising, then dying away almost to a whisper. People living among the Illinois Central rights of the way between Jackson and Waters Valley would turn to their beds late at night, say, "There goes Casey Jones," as he roared by. After he, after he had put several years of freight and passenger engineer between Jackson and Water Valley, Casey was transferred in the early 1900s to the Memphis Canton, Mississippi, as a throttle puller for the Illinois Central Cannonball train. Casey and his foreman, Sim Webb, rolled into Memphis from Canton about 10 o'clock Sunday night, April 29th. They went to checking in the office and were preparing to go to their homes when Casey heard somebody call out, Joe Lewis has been taken with the cramps and can't make his train out tonight. Hey, Salty. Welcome in. And congrats on the 5-star streak. I'll double back and pull Lewis's number 638, Casey volunteered. At 11 o'clock that rainy Sunday night, Casey and Sim Webb clambered into a big engine and eased her out of the station and through the South Memphis yards. All the switchmen knew by the engineer's moans that the man at the throttle was Casey Jones. At 4 o'clock of the 30th of April, the little town of Vaughn, Mississippi, a long, winding curve just above the town, a long side track beginning about the way the curve ended. There's a freight train on the siding, Casey yelled across to Sim Webb. Knowing the siding there was a long one, and having passed many other freights on it, Casey figured he would do the same that night. But there were two separate sections of a very long train on the side track this night, and the rear one was a little too long to get all its length off the main line onto the siding. The freight train crews figured on sawing by, and that it was a passenger train past the front part of the train that would move forward, and the rear freight would move up, and thus clear the main track. But Casey's speed, about 40 miles an hour, was more than the freight crews bargained for. But when the old 638 was within 100 feet of the end of the siding, the horrified eyes of Casey Jones and Sim Webb beheld through the gloom the looming shape of several boxcars in motion, swinging along from the main line to a side track. In a flash, both knew there was no earthly way of preventing the smash-up. "Jump, Sim, and save yourself!" was Casey's last order to his firemen. As for himself, Casey threw his engine in reverse and applied the air brakes, all any engineer could do. He rode roaring 638s into a holocaust of crashing wood that splintered like matchboxes. Sim Webb jumped and fell into some bushes and was not injured. When they took Casey's body from the wreckage, the old 638 had plowed through the cars and caboose and turned over on her side a short distance beyond. They found one hand on the whistle cord and the other on the brake lever. "I remember," Sim Webb told Casey's widow, "that I jumped. Casey held the whistle in a long, piercing scream. I think he must have had it in mind to warn the freight conductor in the caboose if he could jump." Probably no individual, excepting the member of Casey's family, was more affected by the sad news than Wallace Sanders. A few days later, he was going to be singing a song to the melody of his own. The air had a lilt that was caught the fancy of everyone who heard it. But Wallace, an honest old soul, had no idea of doing more than singing it in sort of tribute to his white friend's memory. But one day, a songwriter passed through Jackson heard the song and the details of Casey's tragic death. He went off and changed the words, but retaining the lilting refrain and the name of Casey Jones. That was 1902. 2. There are many railroad men still living who knew and worked with Jones. The affection he aroused among his acquaintances seemed to be an outstanding characteristic. He was 6 feet 4.5 inches tall, dark-haired and gray-eyed. An excellent photograph of him, which has just come to light in the Memphis Press Scimitar, is reproduced as a frontispiece of this issue. His old friend, R.E. Edrington, a fellow engineer in the Illinois Central, writes, "The reputation which Casey enjoyed was richly earned by numerous feats of resourcefulness, skill, and downright daring. He could perform feats with his famous 638 that no other engineer could equal with locomotives of the same class or even with the same engine. Firing for him was back-breaking and hair-raising job, but his mulatto foreman, Sim Webb, was equal to every demand, and held Casey in almost idolatrous regard, following him from one to another in his entire career." A.J. Fatty Thomas, who often ran as conductor on trains, pulled by Casey in the 638, writes, "I've often heard the song about Casey Jones on the account of the phrases in it of the Southern Pacific and Santa Fe, Rounder, Frisco, and another pop on the Salt Lake. I never figured that the song was intended for my Illinois Central Casey, for he was not a rounder but a car roller, and in my estimation the prince of them all. We had a number of fast men, and since I have about 100 of good engineers pull me on different western roads, but I've never met the equal of Casey Jones in hustling to get over the road." The whistle moan in the song is right. Casey would just about play a tune on the whistle. It can make the cold chills run up your back with it, and grin all the time. Everybody along the line knew Casey Jones's whistle. I never saw him with his mouth closed. He always had a smile and a broad grin. The faster he could get his engine to roll, the happier he was. He would lean out the cab window and watch his drivers, and when he got going as fast as the side roads took solid, he could make you grin all over, happy as a boy with the first pair of red boots. Yet he had a reputation as a safe engineer. With all his fast running, I never knew him piling them up, but a few derailments and never rear-ended. He was either lucky, or else his judgment was nearly as perfect as human judgment can be." Ed Pacey, another conductor who knew Casey Jones, writes, "In the early days of railroading, there was a real glamour on the rails. Into this setting, Casey, the engineer of the Cannonball Express, fitted perfectly. He was a giant and came of a great railroad family. His nickname was derived from his native village, Casey, Tennessee, pronounced Casey. Jones was famous for two things. He was a teetotaler in the days when abstinence was rare, and he was the most daring of all engineers in the days when schedules were simply get there and make the time, or come to the office and get your time." Mr. Pacey lodges a protest against the popular song's line in the effect of Casey Jones's widow informed her orphan children that "you've got another pop on the Salt Lake line." Mr. Pacey chafes at the implied disrespect toward Mrs. Jones in that stanza. "There never was another pop on the Salt Lake or any other line," he says. "Instead, the widow devoted her life to the hard struggle to maintain herself and educate her 3 children." The common story of the wreck in which Jones was killed is that Casey had to meet 2 freight trains which were too long to clear the siding. For some reason, never clearly explained, Casey failed to stop, and he piled them up when he struck the caboose and cars protruding out of the main line. According to R.E. Edrington, however, the situation was even more complicated. "It was characteristic," he says, "of the desperate chances which were part of the period of railroading, when the engines were rapidly growing in size and the sidings, safety equipment, and other appliances not keeping pace with them. There were not 2 but 3 trains. 2 of these were northbound and pulling into the siding. The third was racing, in a short time ahead of the Cannonball. As this train scurried down the siding, it dropped off a flagman, but after it pulled down, the flagman rode in with his idea that another train would protest against a cannonball. But the other train crew thought that he was still out and did not flag. So Casey came down as fast as he could turn a wheel, with the result of one of the worst wrecks in the history of the road. 2. The Casey Jones Song. 4 years ago, the Erie Railroad magazine gathered up the real story of Casey's life and death, as told by his widow, who still lives in Jackson, Tennessee. The article was reprinted in railroad magazines and newspapers all over the world, and has brought the continuous stream of letters ever since. Scores of correspondents have sent the various versions of Casey Jones' song, not only in English, but in French, German, and even in the language of the native laborers of the South African railways. Every branch of railroading has at least one version of the song. The hobo jungles and the IWW songbooks contribute others. Still, others come from the campfires and boarding cars of construction games, and several weird and often unprintable versions are composed of doughboys in France during the World War. Yes, Casey Jones. Now I got another song to sing. Come all you rounders, for I want you to hear the story of a brave engineer. Casey Jones was a rounder's name. On heavy 6/8 wheeler he rode to fame. Caller called Jones about 4:30. Jones kissed his wife at the station door. Climbed into the cab with the orders in his hand. Says, "This is my trip to the promised land." Through South Memphis yards on the fly, he heard the fireman say, "You've got a wide eye." All the switchman knew by the engine's moans that the man at the throttle was Casey Jones. It had been raining for more than a week. The rail track was more like the bed of a creek. They rated him down to a 30-mile gait through the southbound mail about 8 hours late. Fireman says, "Casey, you're running too fast. Run the block signal in last station you passed." Jones says, "I think we can make it through. Why, she seems much better than I ever knew." Jones says, "Fireman, don't you fret. Keep knocking on the fire door. Don't give up yet. I'm gonna run her till she leaves the rail. I'll make it on time with the southbound mail." Around the curve or down the dump, 2 locomotives were bound to bump. Fireman hollered, "Jones, it's just ahead. We might jump and make it, but we'll all be dead." 'Twas around this curve he saw a passenger train. Something happened in Casey's brain. Fireman jumped off, but Casey stayed on. He's a good engineer, but he's dead and gone. Poor Casey was always all right. He stuck to his post both day and night. He loved to hear the whistle of the old number 3 as he came into Memphis from the old KC. Headaches and heartaches and all kinds of pain are not apart from the railroad train. Tales of that earnest and noble and grand belong to the man of the railroad man. Yay! Belong to the life of a railroad man. I don't even know if I got any more close to the music. Yeah, let me go close. Yeah, and I got the rhythm on that one. I like that the sheet music is actually written in this book. I'm not sure if I want to start with Macaret tonight. Oh, yeah. 1, 2. Yeah. When I wanted to Magarak, I would not finish before the next ads. This uses the word hunky a lot. Yeah, I think I'll end with Casey Jones tonight. This makes it a little bit shorter stream. And still no cats. But where's my music? Music, why don't you play? There we go. Also, I have hiccups, so let's see who is doing what. Oh, Art Griffin's reading. What is Art Griffin reading? The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Sounds good. So, we're going to read Art Griffin, who is reading a book translated from 1680. Oh, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, so that'll be interesting. So, if you all please join me for the raid. And I will... That was... I think Hans Christian Andersen won the vote, so starting a new book tomorrow. So we'll see everyone there. But for now, have a good night, everyone.